we acknowledge that the lands on which we gather are the traditional gathering place for many Indigenous people. We honor and respect the history, language, ceremony, and culture of the First Nation, Métis, and Inuit who call this territory home. I myself am located on the Songhees and Esquimalt lands. I'm located in Victoria. Mesa BC is dedicated to maintaining an environment that respects and supports the dignity of all attendees at its hosted events. And all participants have the right to an environment free from harassment and bullying. And Mesa BC is committed to proactively creating a workplace where individual differences are recognized and valued. And it's my pleasure to turn the microphone over to Jeff Jacob.
And I am Jeff. I'm the education coordinator for Mesa BC. We're kind of kicking off the 2022 season early with a wonderful presentation from Michelle at the City of Kelowna and Britton at Longview. And we're going to learn about a wonderful topic. And because these topics are so great, we are going to be making this video available afterwards on our YouTube channel. So you'll be able to share it with all of your coworkers who weren't able to attend today. And also I wanted to reach out to the large number of people, 38 of us in here right now, that are here, and say if you have anything really cool that you want to share with Mesa BC that you think other Mesa BC people can learn from, please step up, contact me, education coordinator at Mesa BC, and I will be more than glad to try and set something up so we can make sure we're all moving forward. Other than that, I'm going to hand it off to Michelle and Britton right now. So.
Thank you. I'm Michelle Cam with the City of Kelowna. I'm the grants manager for the City of Kelowna, and I'm coming today. I'm presenting from the traditional ancestral unceded territory of the Silks Okanagan people. Britton? Oh, we can see the presentation. I just didn't know if you wanted to introduce yourself first, and then I'll jump in.
Sorry, yeah, I'll just unmute myself here. Hi, I'm Britton Wells. I'm a technical architect with Longview Systems, and I've worked with Michelle to develop most of the application that you're going to see today that we'll discuss.
Great. So thanks everyone for attending. Today we're going to talk about the grant management system for the City of Kelowna and the app and Power BI that we use with the system. So we have a bit of an agenda. We're going to do a little bit of a grant management introduction. So about 10 minutes, I'll talk to you about our grant management program. And then Britton's going to jump in and talk about the Power platform and do an overview of it. Then we're going to dive into our grant management system and give a demo. And then we'll leave some time at the end for Q&A. So at the City of Kelowna, we pursue alternative revenue generation through grants and sponsorship. The city receives funds from additional, external sources such as senior government. So we receive grants from provincial and federal government, and we use these grants to align with our council priorities and to leverage our tax base to be able to fund our priority projects. Through the grant management program, I've recently developed some tools and resources to make a robust grant management system. This has included a grant policy, a grant procedures manual, some grant templates, as well as I work closely with our sponsorship manager, and we have built out alternative revenue request forms where staff can, if they have a great idea, they can put in a request for us to look for some funding either through grants or sponsorship for their project. So when I first started, just over a year ago, I was using a gigantic Excel form to track the grants with the City of Kelowna. And we receive, on an average, we submit about 26 grant applications in every year. We manage up to about 55 contracts at one time. And so we have a large scope when it comes to grants, right from the planning of grants all the way to the managing of grants. And I was using this large Excel form that had like 45 different columns and 6 different tabs, and I was copying and pasting, and I was constantly within this Excel form, and I was the only one that could see it. So it was not shareable, and it wasn't even very usable. It just was overwhelming to always be in this Excel form. I call it Excel hell, but for those that like Excel, I apologize, but this was not what I knew that we needed. So I had two problem statements. The first one was, how can we automate the grant cycle for planning, securing, and managing grants? Sometimes a grant we will have for 10 years. If our contract is a 10-year contract, we have to keep track of that grant over a number of years. And so we're moving it within this Excel form, copy and pasting, moving it as we go. However, that just really wasn't the right answer. So I knew that there was something better out there. I just didn't know what it was at the time. And the other piece was, I also wanted to move away from a single use where only I could see what we had at the City of Kelowna for grants, to a system that increased the shareability within the organization and also increased accountability for our project leads. So the new grant management system just has so many benefits. It creates a robust city grant management program. We have moved from this manual, time-consuming Excel-based form to a more shareable system. It will increase the accountability for project leads as well as those departments that are managing the grants. It creates shareable, up-to-date dashboarding and reports for others. And it really aligns with the City of Kelowna values of we innovate to make things better, and we work together as one team. And it also adds a high value for our corporate grant management. Now over to Britton for some information on the system.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Michelle. And thanks everyone for taking the time to attend this session today. I'm just going to give a quick introduction to who Longview is. We were established in 1999, fully Canadian, privately owned company. We are based out of a few different locations, lots of presence in Vancouver, as well as Toronto, where I am based. Some guiding principles for the practice that I'm in, which is business applications and data modernization. Some of these may resonate with you, some may not, and that's totally fine. Big focus on DevOps and Agile for us. And that's how we deliver all of our projects, including this one. Very sprint-based, very iterative, and very quick to show early value and iterate from there. Of course, security being top of mind, we like to use this terminology called secure by design, in that from the beginning architecture stages of the solution through to the end delivery, security is always our pretty much number one concern. All right, so that being said, that's all the spiel I'm going to give on Longview. What I'm going to do next is just give a bit of an overview on what the Microsoft Power Platform is, what some of the components are, if you've never sort of heard about it or read about it before. And then we are going to see a pretty in-depth demo of a few components of the Power Platform, including obviously the grant management solution that Michelle was discussing. So one piece of the Power Platform is Power Apps, and that's what we've built the grant management system on top of. And really what Power Apps, as well as the Power Platform, is sort of designed to solve is this app gap challenge. It's really, accelerated obviously by the fact that we're living in a post-COVID world for the most part. And there's just a massive demand for business applications, and there just aren't enough developers and technical talent out there to help deliver these at the rate that they're needed. So yeah, there's limitations around the technical talent. Doing true software development from the ground up takes a lot of time. Obviously, given the world we're in now, a huge amount of demand for all things digital. And whenever you're going to build sort of a custom solution, if you were to do that from the ground up, lots of risk around security and compliance that you would have to consider. And so really what we end up with, without something like the Power Platform is, a huge amount of these business scenarios that just end up in something like a giant Excel spreadsheet. We've all been there, we spin something up, it gets more and more complex. It slows down, it becomes difficult to share, difficult to manage. And it's just not a great experience for the people that have to work with it, that have to update something like that, as well as trying to do any kind of reporting and analytics on the data in a lot of these sort of spread mark tools becomes very difficult. So really you just end up with this case where there's no app for that, given the high barrier to entry for a lot of custom development. So if we start to think about the Power Platform and some of the technical skills, we can kind of look at it on a matrix like this, right? So left-hand side, we have sort of our Word, PowerPoint into Excel, and that's kind of the world that we sort of expect that from most people, right? Today's age, you know, Office becomes sort of a standard thing. Then we might move into something like SharePoint, and we start to get into areas that are pretty broad, like you can be very junior and sort of work with documents in a SharePoint library, but then you can also kind of end up more on the right-hand side as part of some traditional development where you really are truly more of a SharePoint developer. Some stuff in here about, you know, access maybe can come into this a little bit as well, a little bit more kind of under the desk IT going on. And then more over to the right-hand side here, we get into some, you know, more true development and coding languages. Like JavaScript, HTML, sort of the web-based stuff, and then C# or .NET for those truly custom applications. And so traditional development has always sort of leaned on the right-hand side here. And that's really how you ended up with a lot of these business processes that would live in Excel spreadsheets, because there just aren't enough folks on the right-hand side to actually deliver those. So they end up sitting in something like Excel. And so the Power Platform is really meant to span across all of this. And really what that means is that the barrier to entry is very low. We can take, you know, strong users of something like Excel and SharePoint at a basic level and train them pretty quickly on creating a really great basic application in the Power Platform using Power Apps. But that can be extended and sort of hardened off by a pro developer who leans more towards the right-hand side of this distribution. So we've been talking a lot about the Power Platform. There's really four main components that make that up. We're going to focus on two of these today, being the two on the left. But I'll just briefly discuss what each of these components is and what it does. Starting on the left, we have Power BI, and that is Microsoft's data visualization and data modeling tool. So that's basically bring together data from all of your different sources, combine that together in a way that makes sense, and be able to aggregate and visualize that data in a way that really drives a lot of value for the organization. And Power BI has been around for a little bit longer than some of these other tools. So it's quite mature. And many of you may be using Power BI in your organization without necessarily leveraging the rest of these components. So each one of these has value in and of itself, but they all work in sort of a better together context. Second one on the list here is Power Apps. And what this is really a tool for no to low code business application development. And the application you'll see today was built fully on top of Power Apps. It's really kind of an Excel-like formula language, a drag and drop interface. You know, I myself am not a professional developer. I come more from the left side of this. I'm more of a BI and data professional, but Power Apps really enables me to drive even more value for our clients because I can get in there and work without having to know a lot of custom code. The next two we won't discuss a whole lot today, but Power Automate is a workflow automation tool. So a lot of these business processes, we may have a need to visualize and work over data with Power Apps, but there's a lot of things we might need to use Power Automate for in terms of approval workflows, sending out notifications when things happen. Really anything where we need to, you know, automate that process in terms of having one system talk to another, we can typically accomplish that through Power Automate. And the last one here, Power Virtual Agents, that's really a sort of, again, low-no code interactive tool for developing chatbots. A good example of this is if you have some sort of online publicly facing Q&A library, you can feed that into Power Virtual Agents and very quickly create a chatbot that folks can sort of interact with and get answers to those questions. But we won't cover that at all today. So just jumping in a little bit more detail, kind of seeing what these things look like if you haven't seen them before. Power BI, this is really our data visualization and data preparation tool. It really takes down the complexity and lowers the barrier to entry of being able to build out reporting and analytic solutions that in the past, in a lot of legacy tools, had a much higher barrier to entry. And of course, this is something that's supported across mobile, desktop, tablet. We take a deeper look at Power Apps. Again, we're really looking at this web or mobile-based application development. It's this low or no-code development environment. And really, the goal here would be to empower business users to create these applications themselves within it with some training to say, look, I have a use case like this in the context of something like grant management. It's very focused. I want to solve a very specific problem. I'm not building out, a large scale, necessarily like an ERP tool. This is more use case specific. Not to say that you can't have fairly advanced applications, but really works best for specific use cases to come in and solve that problem. And so just my second last slide here is really just showing how these different pieces talk together. So each one of these tools could be used independently and often is, but there's a really good story here around the way that these interact, right? So we're entering data and working with data inside of an application. We can visualize that data inside of Power BI, and we can use Power Automate to drive actions and automate business processes based off of some of those inputs into that application. And Dataverse isn't something that we'll talk about a lot today. It's something maybe in the Q&A we can cover if there's any questions there. But just to touch on it very briefly, Dataverse is something that's within the Power Platform. It is a fully governed and managed, I'm going to call it database plus. It's a great mechanism for storing and securing data if no existing source is available. So fantastic use case. What we're looking at today will be based on something else, something different, but we can chat later if that's something you're curious about. And if we start to think about, how is this extended? We talked about the fact that we kind of have this thing called the Power Platform. We talk about the every developer that can work in there from low code and up. But lots of extensibility here for pro developers, lots of extensibility into the broader Microsoft Azure ecosystem, whether that be in terms of some of the different Azure services that we could tie into. Lots of use cases around cognitive services for enhancing our applications with AI, as well as a lot of the Azure data services where we may have data sitting in the data lake or in a SQL database in Azure, and we may need to interact with that within an application inside of the Power Platform. Okay, and with that, I'm going to jump into a demo of the grant management system and the Power BI reporting and analytics that we've built on top of that. All right, so here I am. I'm just on the landing page, essentially, of our app here. Very simple, clean UI. That's the point with a lot of these apps. Very focused and right to the point. So a grant goes through a few different stages, and we've sort of made the app reflect the different stages of the grant process. So sort of from left to right here, we can think about an opportunity being a grant that the city is considering applying for. So it's basically get the basic information in there that there's a grant available, for example, by the government of BC. There's some potential amount of funding available for certain projects. And we should start to think about whether or not the City of Kelowna was going to go ahead and apply to that grant. The next step there would be that if we decide to go ahead and actually apply, we'll move that from an opportunity to an application, at which point we haven't necessarily applied yet. We may have to gather some documentation and meet all of the requirements to actually proceed ahead with that application, at which point we would apply and then wait to hear back on a decision. If we were successful and we won that grant, it would move into the contracting phase, where we start needing to track the funds coming in and reporting that may have to go back to the provider of the grant in order to continue to receive funding. Michelle, anything you wanted to add there just in terms of the overall process of grants?
No, I think that's a good start, and then I'll jump in when you start into the demo part.
Okay, excellent. So I'll jump in here to the first page, and this is sort of our opportunity management screen. And so here I have a list of 4 opportunities within the application. We can see that we've just listed out some details, the name of the grant, what's the deadline, the amount of the grant, and what that status is. So these are all active opportunities that we haven't really done anything with at this point. We can look at this last one at the bottom, and I of course have a bunch of actions here that we've programmed in. And so the first one, this little pencil, I can click on that, and that's going to take me into a form that lets me edit all of the details associated to this grant. So Power Apps is fantastic for this kind of experience of viewing and editing a list of items, having customized forms over that data. We have things like drop downs to restrict and really help the end user experience. Sliders, date pickers, all the things you'd expect from sort of that modern application are available within Power Apps just to help that process along. And so I could come here and make any changes that I needed to. We can see that in this case, we've had some fields to collect names and phone numbers and email addresses of the grant provider to make that process a little bit easier for Michelle and the team to work with. But I could go ahead and add in some additional information. So as I'm working on one of these opportunities, I'm probably coming in here fairly often. And so, I might go ahead and do something like say that, no, we don't need a council resolution on this item. And I could go ahead and save. And now that's been updated. And so that's as easy as it is to go in and make an edit to that item. And so from there, we may at this point decide that, okay, we're going to proceed with an application for this opportunity. And so we can do things like pop-ups and Power Apps, no problem. And a lot of sort of contextual fields that need to be added. So for example, this requesting department was not initially a required field, but at this point, in order to proceed to that application, I do need to go ahead and specify what that department is, as well as the start date of the application, which by default, we assume is the current day. But if we needed to, we could go ahead and backdate that if we needed to. So I can go ahead and click proceed. And so that has been essentially written back to my source system. In this case, if you're curious, the source for this is a SharePoint list, which is fairly easy to set up and essentially free to maintain for anyone who has SharePoint already. And so we can see that that item has disappeared off of my opportunity list because it's now sitting in the application stage. And on the sort of the left-hand navigation here that we've built out, I can go down to my opportunities and we'll see again this kind of gallery experience. The term is gallery for this kind of view of the data here. And we'll see here's my Village of Newcastle Development Fund. And we can see here that there's a new link. So this gallery is a little bit different in that there's an option to view the SharePoint folder. I can click on that, and that's actually going to take me over into the Longview SharePoint site that I've associated to this. We did set up a little bit of Power Automate in the background And so what that does is it go ahead and creates essentially a folder structure of the department, the name of the grant, and the current year. The reason for this is that at this point, in terms of an application, we need to start collecting documents. And so having that link in terms of we have a SharePoint list and associated documents, and that ties back to our application. So that's a little bit of Power Automate we've used there. A good example of something we need to automate, which is when I move a grant to a certain stage, I need to automatically create the appropriate folder in SharePoint. So we'll go ahead and jump back to our app here. Likely at this point, there's additional information that we might need to come in and add. And so the form sort of evolves over time and additional fields come in. For example, the amount that was applied for, not something that makes sense for an opportunity, but definitely does make sense in the context of an application. So I can go ahead and say maybe we applied for 25,000, submit that, and return back to my list, and I'll see right away that amount shows up. One of the other things about Power Apps that's awesome is that there's no like refreshing of data or anything. It's kind of tied live back to my data source. And every time I take an action, it's reflected immediately in the system. So I could go ahead and do another action here, which is let's take this to a contract, just to continue to sort of show off some of the functionality where at this point, I've got a few different things I want to collect. What date did we receive the approval? The contract, when did this, or when will it start and end? So in this case, let's say that we're going to run from December 1st in about a week from now, hard to believe, through to the end of the following year. And we would hope at this point we would know the contract amount if we've received it, and I could go ahead and approve that. And so you can see through this workflow, we're really guiding the user and providing a lot of context in terms of what data is needed when, versus something like an Excel spreadsheet where you've got 50 columns and things are all over the place and there's really no context provided to you in order to understand what information and when it should be provided.
And Britton, if I could just add before you move on to the contracts, I think another piece that's really valuable here is that under the application status, and Britton, perhaps you could just show, you can do a drop down and decide if you want to just look at denied grants or pending grants. And so you can easily really capture what is, if you take the active off, it will just show just our pending grants. And we know right now, and this isn't real data for the City of Kelowna, but that there'd be 2 pending grants in our demo system that show that those are the ones that we're waiting for to find out whether or not we've received the funding. So we can really quickly see a summary of all the information that's in our grant system.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. Absolutely, didn't want to forget that for sure. And so we can kind of see if we add active back on here. Between the two, we can see that sort of in terms of what buttons show up makes sense in the context of the fact that if this is a pending application, it means we've already submitted it. And at that point, the only outcomes are really we've been denied or approved. Whereas for an active application, we haven't yet submitted the application. And so we can move that to pending. I guess theoretically, we could go directly to contract as well.
And I think one of the other functions that Britton also added in was that you can move this back to an opportunity. So say if something happens and you're working through a grant with some of your groups and they decide that they can't apply for the grant, you can revert it back to an opportunity and restart it, or you can copy it, because sometimes we can apply for put in 2 applications from our municipality for a grant. So you can easily copy it. You don't have to start from scratch every time. So there's a lot of easy functions that were added in here to allow for just a really smooth, efficient process.
Yeah, absolutely. So we can see, I can just demo that quickly. This copy functionality. So we could say, you know, if we've already moved to an application with one, but another department, for example, wants to apply or split that funding potentially, we could copy that back. And now we would see that Canada fund appear back in our opportunity stage. So we made that copy and we set it back to an opportunity. So if we take a look at our contracts at this point, if we sort of scroll down, we'll find our example that we've been working through. At this point, this is now a contract. We can see the amount and the start and end dates. And really, there's a few things we can do at this point. One is to open up this dropdown, and we'll see some reporting requirements and the potential to add additional requirements. And so once we're in the contracting phase, there are requirements to report back on how those funds have been used and how the project is going. So I could say, I'm going to add in a monthly report. And I could say that this would be due maybe at the end of February, for example. And I can add that, and now that's associated directly back to this contract. And if you sort of flip back to the Excel world, you'd be thinking something like a VLOOKUP and a bunch of stuff going on in the background in order to track this kind of association. Power Apps makes that a lot easier to manage and really simple to work with. We could take a look at one of our other grants that we have in here for the purposes of our demo. This COVID-19 resilience grant has lots and lots of reporting requirements associated with it pretty much every month through to the end of the grant. And we can see that there's the edit button within one of these reporting requirements as well, and allows us to put in information such as when were the funds received for that reporting deliverable. Once we've confirmed that we've submitted it on a certain date, if there was a fund allocation associated to that, when did we receive the funds? At this point, we're not tying back to any of City of Kelowna's financial systems. So a little bit of manual work here to kind of associate when funds were received, but that is something that the internal IT team at City of Kelowna is looking at implementing into the future.
I think one more point here for the automate piece is that I'm also working with our IT team to see how we can automatically send a reminder email to the project leads for each of the grants when they have a reporting requirement due. So say 30 days in advance of when their report is due, they would get a reminder that automatically from the system, as opposed to me having to create an email and send it to them as a reminder. So that's another function we're looking at from the City of Kelowna.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Michelle. Okay, so that is the demo of the application itself. In terms of who would have access to this, this is someone who needs to go in and actually make changes to data. And so in this case, for the most part, it's just Michelle going in here and having access. Depending on your use case, you may have a larger audience that you want to have access to the application. And we can have security, and we can sort of go down that path and add some complex user roles and who's allowed to do what and all that kind of fun stuff. But in terms of this use case, there was a lot of interest in having some reporting available that we can more broadly distribute, sort of that read-only, just tell me and inform project managers and inform the organization what is sitting in the system right now, what kind of grants are at each stage. And just understanding a little bit more about that grant process. And this is sort of that visibility and shareability that Michelle referred to. And so we can see here, I'm now inside of Power BI. And so that's sort of the second tool within the Power Platform that we talked about. And this is looking at that same data source that the application is built on top of. So we have the application working, adding to and editing the information, and then Power BI is now visualizing over top of that and is more widely distributed. So we can see here in our summary, I would have, just in this case, a fairly small amount of data for this demo, just the 2 pending applications and 8 active contracts. I can see my total contract amount of $7 million, and I have a bit of a breakdown by the department that was requesting that contract. And if you've ever seen Power BI before, or potentially not, fully interactive. So if I click on that piece of that donut chart, That filters down this page. And so I'm just looking at the requesting department of corporate protective services. In that case, they just have the one active contract associated to them. And so that full $3.2 million, we can see right here that that contract amount is listed for that specific grant. Click again to unfilter, we can see we come out to the summary view again. So on the left-hand side, we can see we have a number of different pages within this report. So this is sort of our high-level view of what's the most interesting thing at a quick glance, but lots of different views of the data depending on what you're interested in looking at. So for example, if we wanted to look at our opportunities, we would have a page just focused on that. And this would also start to look at something like our closed opportunities. What did we not apply for? What opportunities did we defer? Meaning we're going to apply for it at some point in the future, but just not right now. As well, again, as the active grants, of course. And so we can see a few different breakdowns here. For example, the grant provider or the requesting department, sort of a similar theme in terms of those various breakdowns and ways of slicing the data, as well as looking at opportunities by the deadline. If we're thinking about applying for a certain number of grants, it's pretty important to know when that deadline for application would be. Coming down the list here, again, just sort of the sparseness of the demo data, lots of big bar charts, but at this point, active applications, we can take a look and see things like by the grant provider, by the requesting department, details across the bottom. We've now got our SharePoint document link embedded here as well. So for folks that might not necessarily have access to the application, they might want to have the link to view some of that related documentation inside of SharePoint. And so we've provided that link here in the table below for each of those grants. Very similar breakdown for pending applications. This is really just kind of taking each of those specific stages that those grants typically move through and just giving that breakdown, depending on what you're most interested in as a user of the dashboard. So pending applications would be most applicable in terms of, what might we win or lose, because we've submitted that and we're waiting to hear back on potential funding. And a larger piece here around active contracts. So we have $7 million currently being managed in our demo data set. And we can see that our Strengthening Communities grant is the largest. And that because that was associated to corporate protective services, that's the largest department. Again, just that interactivity. So that as I'm sort of going through and selecting various elements on the page, I can see the breakdown and filtering that's going on here. Once we've sort of finished off with the first number of views, we started to think a little bit more in terms of, okay, that was kind of the picture of what is happening right now. But what if I want to go back and analyze the history? And of course, this is sort of the bread and butter of Power BI on data sets, far, far larger than this, but still applicable within this context to sort of look at, okay, we did a bunch of applications. We may have been approved or denied. Those may have moved on into contracts, but let's look back at the previous year and understand what was our approval rate and start to think about what this looks like on a year-by-year basis to try and get some sort of baseline in terms of what that number has been historically, look at what that's been by the type of grant provider or by the department that's requesting, and see if we can start to sort of suss out some trends in terms of number of applications as well as approval rates that we're seeing for each of those. Last couple things that I'll show here. We have some functionality in Power BI to do some pretty cool drill downs. So this case, I'm right clicking on the second row here, my Strengthening Community Services grant. And I have this option to drill through to my grant drill down. And so this page is essentially built to show all of the information associated with a single grant. So if I just kind of want like a printable page of everything to do with that grant, including something like long form text that really doesn't have much of a place on any kind of summary or aggregated view, I can have that in a kind of drill down page like this. White box in the middle is sort of blocked off because this was meant to contain a lot of names of project managers internally and contact information of the grant provider. And lastly, for contracts, we can see those reporting requirements down here at the bottom, along with those associated dates and contract allocations in terms of dollars. And then a couple of things we added that were pretty useful. First, well, both of these are calendar views, really. In this case, we're looking at grant application deadlines. So just like your Outlook calendar, we're basically taking data from our source here and just visualizing that inside of a calendar visual. In this case, we can see that next week we'd be pretty busy with lots of grants coming due for application. In a similar sense, we could look at our contractual reporting requirements and say, okay, at a quick view, what kind of contracts in terms of those reports are coming due. And so if these are not yet done, I probably need to go ahead and sort of chase down those project managers and make sure that they're submitting those reports. This is the piece that currently the team is looking at automating in terms of having reminders go out to the project managers to say, okay, December 1st, did you know that your annual report is coming due for the COVID support grant, for example? And so they would need to go ahead and submit that report.
Britton, could you also just show the filter function on the right-hand side?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so within Power BI, we have the built-in filters pane here on the right-hand side. And this lets us just put lots of different filters on the report. We may have very many fields that we might want to filter by that would clutter up sort of our reporting canvas if we were to add them on the page. So for example, I could come down and I could filter my requesting department and just look at one, for example. So in this case, I could say, I'm just looking at the active living and culture department, and we'll see that this is now filtered down and I'm only looking at that one versus if I come off here, there's a bunch of other reports. So I could do that for text fields. I could do that for dates. That could be sort of an advanced filter. Like I want to see just the reports from today until the next 30 days. I could look at the same information relative to the current day. So, in the last 30 days or in the last year, all that kind of functionality is built in into the filters pane. And I can customize and format this as I feel to kind of match the brand. But useful, especially when you want to look across multiple date fields. Try to think of an example here, but maybe on my summary page, I would like to look at a summary of the active contracts where we were approved within the past 6 months. And we started the application process within the past 8 months, for example. So some kind of complex scenario where I want to say dates A and B and C. That might be a good use case for having lots of different date filters on the filter pane. Main reason being, here's an example of a slicer on the canvas. So this becomes essentially like a visual on the page where I could go ahead as well and filter down my data. So lots of different ways of filtering, whether that's interacting on the canvas by selecting components of a visual, by leveraging the filter pane on the right-hand side, or by creating slicers on the canvas. And so the benefit of filter pane being that I don't need to put a huge amount of slicers and take up, kind of that precious real estate that I'd like to use for my visuals. Okay, I would love to keep essentially the last 14, 15 minutes we have here for Q&A. Michelle, anything to add before we kind of open up the floor here?
No, I think that's great. I think just really the value for the system is really twofold. It is to get so that we have this really easy way to track all of our grants. And then, as you see with this new dashboard, a way that we can share this with others and have others be able to interact with their own division's grants without having to always ask me the question. They can go into the dashboard and be able to look at that themselves.
Fantastic. All right. So with that, I think we'll go to Q&A.
And we do have a couple questions in the chat here. I'm going to read some of these out, but I just wanted to say if anybody wants to come on video and ask their own question, and that, just feel free to hit the raise hand button at the bottom of your Zoom window or put it in the chat and we can read it out. The first question we had from Herb there was, is this live data on the populating the dashboard, or is it refreshed nightly?
In this case, we made the decision just to go ahead and do a nightly refresh, just because the data itself is not changing that often. Of course, that is something that could be changed. Just in this case, we didn't need to. Given that our data source is SharePoint, there are some limitations around having truly live, essentially data refresh against that. So SharePoint does not support natively direct query, but it could be refreshed far more often than once a day if needed.
So this one's my question. Why did you go with SharePoint as opposed to like an Azure SQL or something like that?
For sure. The easiest answer to that is that it's free. You just create the SharePoint list and you're good to go. In terms of the Power Apps licensing, something that everyone can just kind of throw into Google there. There'll be a few different options, but for all intents and purposes, if you are on some kind of Office 365 environment, where that's, you're using Word and Office and Outlook and everything, you're going to typically have an E3 or an E5 license. In that case, assuming your data source is SharePoint, which is one of the non-premium connectors, there's no licensing cost for Power Apps. If you go to something like a SQL Server or a Dataverse, as we discussed previously, those would be considered a premium connector, meaning your app becomes premium, and then there is some licensing costs associated with it.
So one person was asking, you covered the licensing. How long did it take to put all of this together? It's a very impressive app, looks really good. How long did it take to get that all working?
Yeah, so we spent, I would say, about 2 months of pretty intensive back and forth development, and then maybe a month or so of kind of focusing more a little bit on the reporting, as well as just things that come up in testing and using it every day. What I will also say there is that this is sort of the City of Kelowna, their first kind of foray into the Power Apps world. And so once you get your first one done, the subsequent ones come a lot faster, because a lot of these kind of business processes follow a pretty similar flow of there's something that moves through these different stages. And then, we need to take actions or add information at certain points, right? So it's obviously not as simple as a copy and paste, but you're greatly accelerating your development cycle as you build more and more of these applications.
Practice does make perfect. One thing that does have to be perfect that somebody's asked about is the security. Like, who has access to these? Who has access to do different things? How hard is it to do that and do it right? Like, where you need IT to help?
Yeah, so I would say in terms of security, it's going really to depend on how sensitive the data is. So for something like this, where it's, not entirely not sensitive, but in this case, the SharePoint list is only accessible by Michelle and a small subset of users. And so that's how we handled security, which was essentially the only users using the application have access to the SharePoint list. Some of the other sources, like when we start talking about Dataverse, there's a lot more support there for more stringent security in terms of roles, who can add, who can delete, who can edit records. So a lot more support within something like Dataverse if you need a lot of kind of complex security rules, where SharePoint would be more simple, like this user has access to this record, yes or no, and that would be it. Otherwise, the applications themselves and all of those different components are all authenticated through your Active Directory. So from that perspective, in terms of user authentication, it's as secure as anything else within the Microsoft ecosystem. Just looking through some of the questions as well. Sure, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, for the City of Kelowna, what we do is that we have some extra levels of security that only certain people can see the dashboard. So we haven't given access to the entire corporation because not everybody's working on grants. And so we have a subset of about, 100 people that are senior leaders, business leaders, managers, and project leads that can have access to the dashboard. And then if they want to access one of the documents, so the grant agreement or our grant contract, anything that's stored in the SharePoint folder, they actually have to then request access on top of that. And so then that just makes sure that we are keeping confidential and sensitive information just with those that need it. So that's sort of the way that we've been dealing with the security piece.
For sure. I just saw one other question there, kind of correcting one of the previous questions around the licensing cost for Power BI. And yes, so for Power BI, the reporting piece we saw, there would be a licensing cost associated with that. Again, depending on your Office 365 license. So if you're on E5, it's included. Otherwise, I believe it's $12.80 Canadian per month per user. What I would say there is that Power BI is not a required component of this solution. That's what City of Kelowna was using as part of the Power Platform to kind of drive that synergy. And the assumption here would kind of be that Power BI is a tool that probably is adopted more widely in the organization. And it's something that we can tie into for multiple different use cases, right? We're not going and licensing Power BI just for grant management. It's more that Power BI is available. And so for this use case, it's essentially free because the organization has adopted Power BI as their tool of choice.
And there was a couple of questions early on that I kind of skipped over because I thought it might be a little more time, is on how it actually looks. Is it possible for you to pull up one of these in the developer portion and just show us how it kind of looks when you're building it?
Yeah, for sure. I can just flip back over. I'll show, so from a Power Apps perspective, this was essentially like a preview. So I'm kind of like in my development environment, but showing this live. So if I basically close this out, all of a sudden kind of the curtains pulled back and now I'm in the development environment. So really easy for demo purposes, but we'll see things like when I select an object, I can kind of, drag this around on the page and I kind of get almost like a PowerPoint experience in terms of being able to move these objects around. And some things like, okay, so how do I make it into an application rather than just like a PowerPoint slide? Every object within the environment essentially has a bunch of properties. That's from things like, how wide is it? What position is it on the page? What's the color? But on select is basically when I click this button, what do I do? In this case, I'm saying when you click on the opportunities button, you navigate to the opportunities screen and we have some sort of fade transition. So that's like super simple in terms of making a very basic interface to navigate around. And of course, it gets more and more complex from there when we start to talk about, having pop-ups come up and stuff like that. But for the most part, we have different screens on the left-hand side that I can kind of navigate between and kind of the standard ribbon in terms of inserting labels, buttons, inputs, stuff like that. So this is kind of the overall interface that you'd be in as a developer. There's actually no software required to download or anything like that. It's all browser based as well.
How is it for responsive design? Is it pretty much a fixed layout here?
It can be responsive. It requires a little bit of work to do, to be fair. And there's a fairly major choice when you first create one of these applications, whether it's going to be mobile or desktop as really the primary use case. So if it's going to be something that's, you're out in the field and we want to use a lot of the mobile features, we can, attach photos. Maybe we need like GPS coordinates, all that kind of stuff. You'd start off with kind of the mobile layout and you'd be developing entirely for that purpose. Otherwise, there are ways to make this slightly responsive. But at this point, it really isn't truly responsive from a full desktop to mobile. You kind of do have to make that decision at some point.
Awesome. And the other side of this is you said there was a Power Automate flow, something that updated one of the processes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Show us that.
For sure. I could probably pull that up. I'll do it off screen quickly here, maybe while I try and answer another question. A good starting point to learn how to build this type of application. I would suggest just going into Google and search for something called App in a Day. It's something that Longview delivers, but lots of other Microsoft partners deliver as well. Microsoft themselves will deliver some of those. And that's really, it is a full day, but that is sort of an intensive, learn how to build a basic application. That's the best place to go. Otherwise, lots of good stuff on YouTube. You can search Power Apps 911 is a fantastic YouTube channel for some in-depth training as well. So here's the Power Automate flow. Very simple. Basically, this is it. I'm specifying the trigger is Power Apps asks for something. I specify some inputs, and this goes ahead and creates the folder. And then what I do is respond to that Power App button press, essentially, with the link of that SharePoint item that was created. So that's the only flow in here, but very useful, very simple.
Very cool. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Seems like we're good for time. I think we got all the questions, which is great.
And should people be able to reach out to you if they need to? Would you be able to put your email in chat or a good contact email for Longview?
I'll just jump into and say that we'll send out a recording of this to everybody that was present today. And we can also include your contact details on there as well, Britton.
For sure. Yeah. So I threw it in the chat, but yeah, that email will go out. Otherwise, longviewsystems.com. You'll see the data modernization link in there and the link to get in touch with us. Otherwise, yeah, definitely feel free to reach out to me directly and I'll get you off to the right place.
Awesome. So with that, I think we're going to call this to a close. And I wanted to thank everyone for showing up and, of course, our wonderful hosts for presenting.
Thanks, everyone.
You have yourselves a great day.